Thank you. Thank you, Bob and Chris, and it's great to be here. And thank you to the festival committee, and thanks to all of you for making all of this possible with your interest in birds. Thanks for coming out today. And as Bob and Chris have said already, thanks for your endurance, your persistence, your patience in getting out there today. It was actually a really good day to be out, despite the rain, along with the rain. I hope everybody saw interesting things. It sounds like you did. It reminds me of an expression that a friend of mine named Noble Proctor from Connecticut, he passed away a few years ago. Some of you, does anybody here know Noble Proctor? Yes. He was just a great all-around naturalist and a great teacher and a great mentor to me when I was a young kid. And he, one of his expressions was, "There's always something to see. Just go outside. There's always something to see." And I think we proved that today. So I am here to talk about some of the things that I learned while I was working on my newest book, What It's Like to Be a Bird. And I'll begin by talking a little bit about how the book came to be. It started out as an idea for a children's book about 20 years ago. I started thinking about it, and I didn't want to do just a simplified field guide, identification guide. I wanted to include some information about some of the things that birds do, the things that make birds really amazing, to explain some of what's going on when a bird is doing what it does. And as I started researching those things, right away I started learning things, relearning things that I thought I had known. For example, that my whole life I had grown up, everyone I knew told me that birds' feet automatically clamp onto a perch when they bend their legs, that they sleep. They can hang onto their perch at night while they sleep because as they bend their leg, their toes automatically close around the branch. And it happens with birds in the hand. It's easily demonstrated in some circumstances, but apparently if you actually look at a bird that is sleeping on a twig, its toes just hang loosely over the branch. They don't do that at all. They just balance while they sleep. So things like that I learned, it just kind of shook the foundation of everything that I knew about birds. And almost every day that I worked on this book, I learned new things. So I still wanted it to be, it started as a book for kids, so I was trying to channel my own sort of 10-year-old birding self. And I decided to try to do portraits, roughly life-size portraits of all of the featured species, which was a really fun artistic challenge to try to fit a life-size bird onto an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And scenes like this developed out of that challenge. This currently is not life-size, just to be clear. We would be in a lot of trouble if kingbirds were that big. But it was a lot of fun coming up with the ideas for the illustrations and putting the whole book together. It gave me a chance to feature some species that I really enjoy, like double-crested cormorant, that really doesn't get its due. It's a gorgeous bird, just stunningly beautiful, and gets a bad rap, I think. And how many of you have seen the inside of a cormorant's mouth when it yawns? Yes, so you know the incredible, it's almost like the color of this bird's eye, this blue-green color inside a cormorant's mouth. And I took the approach of asking and answering questions in the book. And one of the questions that I tried to answer, that I came up with, was a question from my youth. The Roadrunner cartoon: is a roadrunner really that much faster than a coyote? And the answer here in graphic form is no. A coyote is about twice as fast as a roadrunner, almost as fast as an ostrich. The roadrunner and Usain Bolt are pretty close, neck and neck, and the average human is lagging far behind. And one of the things that I kept running up against in my research and that I tried to highlight in the book, because I think it's kind of exciting, is how much we don't know about birds. There's so many unanswered questions about even really common backyard birds. This is a chimney swift, which here in the West you have a very similar species, Vox's swift. Chimney swift is it's a familiar town bird in the East. They nest in chimneys in towns. Most people who live in a small town in the East have chimney swifts flying around every day. And you get used to their sounds and seeing them. They come and circle the chimneys in the evening and drop into the chimneys to spend the night. And in the fall, they disappear. And the big question, well, the first question is what they do all day. They fly up into the sky and they disappear, and you rarely see them except on rainy days. So presumably the answer is that they're up in the sky catching things. They eat flying insects. And apparently, if you drag a plankton net around at 5,000 or 10,000 feet up, you'll catch a lot of baby spiders. So there's some thought that chimney swifts are eating a lot of baby spiders that are floating around on their strands of silk a few thousand feet up. But nobody knows how high they go, how far they go. They leave their nesting chimney early in the morning, disappear into the sky. They might come back a few times during the day to feed their young, if they have young. And in the evening they come back, but exactly what they're doing all day is a complete mystery. And similarly, they spend the winter in South America. The few that have been confirmed in the winter have been found right up on the east side of the Andes in Peru, Ecuador. But not very many have been found there. Possibly there's not a lot of bird study going on there, and they blend in with some of the very similar local species. But it's also possible that they spend the entire winter in the air. That's been documented for a couple of other species of swifts recently that are big enough to carry transmitters that track their movements and confirm that they spend the entire winter, 9 or 10 months of the year, they're flying, never touching anything solid. And I think it's possible that chimney swifts leave their nesting, roosting sites in the US in the fall and fly all winter until they come back in the spring. But again, nobody knows. And over, I ran into those kinds of questions, things that just aren't known. And I'll have a few more examples in here. So the bird I want to focus on tonight is belted kingfisher, which is a familiar bird, and they have a habit of hovering 10 or 20 feet above the water and diving headfirst to catch fish. And what they do when they're hovering, if you have a chance to watch one closely while it's hovering, you'll see the same thing with a kestrel or any similar hovering bird. The body is bouncing around, the wings are flapping, the tail is fanning and closing to adjust. They're putting a lot of effort into flying and holding their place in the air, and through all of that, their head is absolutely still at a fixed point in space. And I have created a very crude animation of that out of my illustration to give you a better idea of what they're doing. Their head is absolutely still in space while they make all these adjustments with their body and their wings and their tail to keep their head in that position. And I'm going to talk about some of the things, not all of the things, some of the things that go into that amazing feat. First, there's flying. They have birds have a very specialized respiratory system. It takes a lot of oxygen to fuel that much exercise, muscle activity, and they can do that. They have extraordinary vision that helps to maintain this position in the air. They have to be able to sense airflow, the air movement around their feathers, to make all the adjustments to hold their position in the air. They have very sensitive, they're very sensitive to the air movement around them, much more sensitive than you would think, given that they're covered with a layer of feathers. They have to balance, essentially knowing the position of their body, how it's moving, the angle of the body, the head. Then they have to make adjustments. The neck has to absorb all of the motion of the body so that the head stays still. So it's kind of, it's just, I think it's impossible for us to really comprehend how that happens. I guess well, we'll talk more about that. And then finally, deciding when is the right time, which fish to dive on, when to actually pull the trigger and make that dive. So it all begins with dinosaurs, because birds are the direct descendants of dinosaurs. Lots of dinosaurs had feathers. This one, Ankylosaurus, lived about 160 million years ago and had feathers that were similar to modern ostrich feathers. This was a little smaller than a roadrunner, about the size of a roadrunner, a tiny, tiny dinosaur. At this time, the first birds were appearing, Archaeopteryx, and 100 million years after this, there were many birds, many flying birds, and all of the dinosaurs and all but 3 species of birds were wiped out by the asteroid that hit in the Yucatan 65 million years ago. So only 3 species of birds survived that asteroid impact, and in 65 million years radiated into all of the birds we know today. This is the proposed timeline for the evolution of feathers. Feathers did not evolve from scales. Feathers started as hollow bristles on the left. And then the fibers that make up the bristle separate to form a kind of fuzz or like down. The next stage, a branching pattern develops with a central shaft and barbs on the side, and that's like an ostrich feather, like the Ankylosaurus. But they're kind of floppy and loose. The barbs don't hold to each other. And the next stage is another level of branching. So each barb then branches into multiple barbules off the side that hook onto the barbules from the barb next to it. And that forms a more solid surface and starts to make flight possible and many other things. And the final stage is very specialized feathers like the one on the right, which is one of the long flight feathers from a modern flying bird, with all kinds of incredible adaptations that help to make flight possible and efficient. But one thing this shows is that flight was one of the later developments in the evolution of feathers. Feathers started as insulation, coloration, protection, and gradually evolved into forms that supported all kinds of other functions. One of those functions is waterproofing, and this is another thing I learned as I was working on this book, that the oil that birds preen into their feathers is not particularly important for waterproofing. The structure of the feather is what makes it waterproof. The spacing of the barbs is too close together for water to flow through. The surface tension of water prevents a drop of water from going through the feather. And because the barbs are narrow and spaced apart, the drop of water is making contact with very little of the surface of the feather, so it doesn't stick very well, it just rolls off. And the oil that the birds preen into their feathers certainly helps to keep water from sticking to the feathers, but it's the feather itself that creates most of the waterproofing. And birds that dive underwater have barbs spaced closer together because they're encountering water under pressure and need more closely spaced barbs to keep water from going through. Land birds have barbs spaced wider apart, which is better because it gives the water less surface to stick to, but they wouldn't be able to dive underwater and stay dry. And one question that always follows that statement is, what about cormorants? Cormorants do have preen oil. They preen oil into their feathers just like other birds, and their feathers are waterproof like other birds. Their skin doesn't get wet. The surface of the feathers gets wet, and the one hypothesis is that that happens because they have, well, one of the functions of the barbules is not just to keep the barbs stuck tightly to each other, but to keep them from being pulled too close together where water could stick to them. It helps to keep the barbs all at the right spacing. So a cormorant's feather here on the right is the center of the feather has barbules that keep the barbs at the right space. The margin of the feather, they have no barbules. It's just loose barbs, like a fringe. And that part gets wet. Water sticks to it. And cormorants apparently can swim in the water for 15 or 20 minutes, and then they start to get wet. The surface gets so wet, waterlogged, that they have to get out. And then they'll sit and they'll shake off, sometimes sit on the water, flap their wings, hold their wings out to dry off a little bit before they even take off. And all of that, again, nobody knows exactly why this happens, why they have this adaptation, but cormorants are, as currently measured, the most efficient marine predator in the world. They catch more prey per minute of foraging than any other marine animal. So they're doing something right. And now I have an ornithologist friend who she has a couple of her research projects are featured in this book, but she's taken an interest in feathers and in this question of waterproofing, and she tells me that it's nowhere near as simple as I make it sound. We'll leave it at that. Another adaptation that makes flight possible, one of the biggest, is that a bird's body has become very compact and centralized in a very small and compact form that is centered below the wings. So this pheasant, I've painted the body in sort of reddish color, the feathers all in gray. So you can see that the tail is entirely feathers, the wings are almost entirely feathers, the neck is very thin, the head is small, there's a lightweight bill, no teeth, and all of the weight, all the big muscles that power the wings and the legs are all incorporated into that central body mass. It's like the chicken that you buy in the store. The whole chicken is packaged in an oval, an oval plastic bag. That is the body of a bird. There's not much more to it. And that is one of the big things that makes flight possible. I use the example in the book of try making a paper airplane and taping a penny to it in different places. The only place it will fly correctly is with the penny taped right in the center underneath the wings. And that's the way a bird's body is designed or has evolved. For the respiratory system, this was one of the most challenging things for me to figure out and simplify and diagram in the book. Birds have a completely different respiratory system from ours. When we breathe in, our lungs expand. Well, our rib cage expands, that pulls air in as our lungs expand. Air is exchanged in the lungs, and then we compress our lungs to force air out. The used air gets pushed out, and we breathe in fresh air and do it again. Birds' lungs are rigid, they're fixed. They don't expand and contract. Air just flows through them And birds have a system of air sacs that move air through the body. And the system works so that air is moving through the lungs, fresh air moves through the lungs on inhale and exhale. So birds are getting a continuous supply of fresh air through their lungs all the time, inhaling and exhaling. And in this diagram, the lungs are in purplish, and the air sacs in blue. The inhale is shown at the top with air coming in from the right through the airway, being pulled into the rear air sac. Air is being pulled forward through the lungs, and used air is stored in the front air sac on the right. On the lower image, the exhale, the air sacs are compressed, air is squeezed out. The fresh air that was just pulled into the rear air sac gets pushed forward through the lungs, and the used air that was stored in the front air sac gets pushed out. And one of the mysteries about this is that there are no valves. It's all open passageways, and nobody knows why air only goes in one direction. Why, when they breathe in, fresh air doesn't get sucked into the front air sac. All the fresh air that they breathe in goes into the rear air sac and forward through the lungs. So another big mystery. And it's thought that this respiratory system evolved in dinosaurs a couple of 100 million years ago, when there was only half as much oxygen in the atmosphere as there is now. And they needed a super efficient respiratory system. This developed, and now birds are the beneficiaries. And they do amazing things with this. It's safe to say you've never seen a bird that's out of breath. If you see a bird panting, it's because it's too hot, but they are never out of breath. Experiments with hummingbirds in air chambers where they reduce the oxygen level to the equivalent of 10,000 feet higher than Mount Everest. Hummingbirds can still fly at that level of oxygen. So vision is another aspect of birds that is really amazing, and it's pretty diverse among different species of birds. There are a lot of different visual systems, but in general, all birds, I think, process visual information more quickly than we do. So we process images at about something under 25 images per second, which is why motion pictures, videos all happen at 27, 30 frames per second. We can't process the images that fast, and they all blur together. We see a moving picture. Birds process images twice as fast. Some, like the flycatchers, like this black phoebe, even more than twice as fast as we do, 70 images per second. And so presumably if they watched one of our movies, they would see it as a slideshow, a series of still pictures. They would be able to process each image before the next one showed up. And it's clear what the benefit of that is when a bird like this, a black phoebe, they fly at full speed, tracking the movement of a mosquito or a tiny gnat through the air, weaving between twigs and foliage, and snapping that insect out of the air. And high-speed video shows that they don't just fly through and kind of fly their mouth over the insect as they go. They get close to it and they pluck it out of the air with the tip of their bill. So imagine just following the movement of a mosquito and plucking it out of the air with a pair of tweezers. That is what a phoebe is doing. And their vision makes that possible. And things like predators like Cooper's hawks, peregrine falcons, they're moving at such high speed and tracking their prey, which is also moving at very high speed. They're dodging twigs. They're doing all this stuff. Being able to track all of that movement at such high speed is really critical. And birds see a lot more of their surroundings than we do. This snipe is particularly uh, adept at seeing its surroundings. Snipe and some other, most shorebirds can see 360 degrees around, um, and 180 degrees of sky, the entire sky and the entire horizon, the whole hemisphere above them, all at once. They're seeing the entire world around them. And where we see one tiny point of detail with both eyes focus on the same spot. Snipe, well, they're all birds, their eyes point in different directions. Snipe see a whole band of detail along the horizon. Instead of one point of detail, they're seeing a long strip of detail along the horizon on both sides. They don't see very well straight ahead, and they can't see the tip of their bill. They hunt entirely by feel, taste, and smell. But if danger threatens, they can crouch and rely on their camouflage, and without moving, still see everything that's happening around them to know when it's time maybe to burst into flight and try to escape. Other birds like eagles and probably the kingfisher, their eyes are placed a little farther forward, and they see 2 points of detail with each eye. One point of detail kind of angled off to the side, and one point of detail sort of straight ahead, but again, they don't see very well straight ahead. They only have a small area of binocular vision straight ahead of them and not very detailed there. It's good for judging distance so they can see when they're getting close to a perch, but they don't, if they want to see detail, they turn their head, and that's what this bald eagle on the left here is actually looking straight at you. It is giving you its full attention, looking at you with the most detailed vision it can muster, with one point of detail in one eye. So when a bird really wants to study you, it turns its head and looks at you with one eye. And you see robins hopping around on the lawn, tilting their heads. And we always think they're listening for worms, but they're actually looking for worms. And doing this, they're using one eye, aiming one eye at the ground to look in detail at one spot and look for evidence of worms being active. So the kingfisher, while it's hovering, and the main reason for keeping its head perfectly still is probably to maintain its vision. It's probably looking at the fish with one point of detail in one eye, and using the other points of detail in one or both eyes to fix on some objects at a distance, and use those to calculate its position, to calculate its movement, maintain its position in the air, and also monitor for danger of any approaching merlin or peregrine or other predator that might be coming. So it's monitoring several different things at the same time with its eyes, and seeing it all in fast motion, or slow motion, a lot more frames per second. And it's actually similar to what pigeons do. Pigeons and other walking birds often bob their heads when they walk. And the function of that is to keep their head perfectly still at a fixed point in space while their body moves underneath. So the head snaps forward, stops, and holds perfectly still while they pick up one foot and move the body forward. And then the head snaps forward again, and the next step carries the body forward underneath it. But as the head stays perfectly still in space, they can get a really good fix on their surroundings. It's much easier to see movement to detect any movement around you if you keep your vision perfectly still. And one interesting experiment with pigeons regarding this, researchers put pigeons on a treadmill, and when they walk on a treadmill, their surroundings don't change. They're not moving, so they don't bob their heads. They fix their eyes on their surroundings and walk, and they keep their head in the same position because they're not moving. Imagine putting in the proposal, the grant proposal for that experiment. Birds' vision also surpasses ours in a couple of other ways. They can see polarized light, which gives them the ability to know where the sun is, even when it's cloudy, and other things. And birds can also sense the magnetic field, and not just the direction, the compass direction of the magnetic field, but the slope of it. The magnetic field emerges out of the north. I think it emerges out of the North Pole and travels vertically and then gradually arcs over the Earth. So at each point from the pole to the equator, the slope of the magnetic field is changing, and sensing that gives the birds some clue of where they are in terms of latitude. And that sense, nobody knows really how they sense it, but the sensory equipment that birds have is pretty closely linked to their vision. So there's a thought that it might be at least processed along with vision. So I was imagining my artist's conception here of how a black and white warbler might see the magnetic field, to actually see some representation of the blue line showing polarized light band across the sky, and the red line showing the magnetic field with a dot for where the slope would be. And imagine, when we think about this for migration all the time, how birds would navigate from Alaska to South America, but imagine a bird like a coot wandering around through its dense cattail nesting territory, having a compass all the time to know exactly what direction they're going would be very useful. I think the magnetic sense is probably useful for birds all the time. And it makes sense that they would have access to it in some way all the time. So in terms of sensing what's going on around them, birds are completely covered with feathers, which provide really good insulation. It's surprising that they are able to sense air currents the way they do, but they have specialized feathers called phyloplumes, really modified feathers, little tiny strands with a little fluffy tip. And phyloplumes grow at the base of every feather on a bird's body. And there's been some experiments that hint strongly that phyloplumes are useful for sensing the movement of feathers, that they're essentially the bird's sense of touch. And it's really amazing. Sometimes you'll see a bird it'll have a little bit of dirt stuck on one feather, and it just can't rest until it gets that bit of dirt off. It might take a few steps and then reach back and try to preen that and shake itself and take a few more steps, and the dirt's not gone. It goes back and works on it some more. Or if a fly lands on their back, they're immediately going after that. And they're incredibly sensitive. They have to be incredibly sensitive to air movement, to the way air is moving around their wings and their body, to be able to adjust to the air currents to fly the way they do. And a recent study on birds that fly in V formation, like these geese, found that they fly in a V formation because they're using updrafts created by the bird in front of them. Most of the bird's wing leaves air moving down, a downdraft, but off the tip of each wing, there's a swirl of air that creates an updraft. And the following bird positions itself to the side so that one wing is traveling through the updraft of the bird in front of them. And they found that they even track the wave of the wing flap of the bird in front. The bird in front its wings are flapping up and down as it moves forward through the air, and the following bird follows the same track through the air. Somehow they can sense air movement well enough to know when they're in the sweet spot and catching the most of that updraft that they can, and it's a significant benefit for flight efficiency if they can catch that little bit of updraft. But it requires an incredible sensitivity to air movement that could only come through these the filar plumes that are connected to nerve endings in the skin, just very sensitive to feather movement, which is generated by air movement. Now, another thing, I mentioned the birds sleeping and balancing while they sleep. They have an incredible sense of balance. And one of the things that explains that is that they have a balance sensor in their inner ear, like we do, in their head. They're in the inner ear. They have another balance sensor in their pelvis. A similar structure, a semicircular canal structure, but a balance sensor in their pelvis, so they can monitor the movement and angle and tilt of their body and their head separately, which explains a lot for how a bird can stand on one leg and preen itself, swinging its head around. And we only have the balance sensor in our head, so if you might be able to stand on one leg, but you wouldn't be able to swing your head around looking in different directions and doing all that. You'd lose your balance because all of your balance sense is in your head. But birds have this extra balance sensor in their pelvis, and this, again, for the kingfisher there in flight, being able to keep its head perfectly still and at the same time monitor all the movement of its body bouncing up and down. And to be able to react to that movement by making adjustments with their neck. And birds' necks are surprisingly long. We don't think of birds having long necks, but this is a golden crowned kinglet on the left, and this illustration is in the book to show it's in a discussion about birds' hearts, but it shows how even a small, compact, dumpy little bird like a golden crowned kinglet has a really long neck hidden in there. And all birds' necks are really flexible. Owls get all the credit for being able to turn their heads completely around. They can't quite do that. They can turn their head almost all the way around, but even in a golden crowned kinglet, they turn their head 180 degrees almost and tuck their bill into their back feathers to sleep. They're incredibly flexible. So that long flexible neck is what provides the shock absorber between the kingfisher's body and head, and then they just have to have the instantaneous reactions of monitoring the movement of the body and reacting to that to compensate for every movement of the body to keep the head still. So finally, the kingfisher has to make a decision. And one of the things that really struck me as I worked on this book was that birds are making decisions all the time. We think of them as being driven by instinct, and the instinct is very important and instructs a lot of what they do, but they are still making decisions all the time. And this illustration, I talk about how a tufted titmouse at a bird feeder faced with seeds of different sizes, you might expect it to just grab the biggest seed and fly away with that one. But the biggest seed, it's harder to carry, it's more conspicuous, more attractive to someone else to steal it, it's harder to hide, it's harder to process. Once you get it into the woods, you have to take more time to break it apart. And so they'll choose a smaller seed, probably, and they want the seed with the most calories, the most food value, which is often the heaviest seed. And apparently what birds like chickadees and titmice and sometimes woodpeckers, when they come to a bird feeder, they'll sort of rake through all the seeds that are there and pick up a couple and drop them and then find one they like and fly away with that. And apparently the main thing they're measuring is the weight of the seed, the relative weight. So 2 seeds of the same size, they will choose the heavier one because it's more likely to have more fat content. So this titmouse is going to choose the seed that is the best balance of easy to handle and highest food value. And there's been some really interesting studies of birds choosing food. A study that was done in San Francisco Bay with western gulls found that the adult gulls would go to the dump to find food for themselves and then fly out into the bay to get anchovies and shrimp and crabs and other things to feed to their young. They're very careful about what they feed to their young, even though they're eating garbage themselves. And similarly, black-capped chickadees, they feed their young protein-rich caterpillars, lots of little green inchworms. But for the first week after the eggs hatch, they feed a very high proportion of spiders. And apparently spiders are high in taurine, which is an essential nutrient and important for brain development. So the chickadees instinctively know that the babies need spiders. And then they need protein. And the adult chickadees might be visiting a bird feeder, getting sunflower seeds for themselves, but they'll go out into the woods and find other food to feed to the young. Nesting is something that birds instinctively know how to do, but they make decisions also about exactly where to build the nest, what materials will work, what materials to use. They can adjust on the fly and build a nest out of whatever is available. They'll build a nest that's thicker and more insulated in colder climates or colder weather. And one of the biggest decisions birds make, I think, is when to migrate. Which night is the right night to take off into the sky and fly hundreds of miles? So all of that is going on all the time in all of these birds that we are seeing. There's an incredibly rich and complex life behind all of what we're seeing out there. And even a bird as simple as a California scrub jay, there's just a tremendous amount going on. They're seeing more, understanding more, hearing more, thinking more than I ever imagined that they were before I did all the research for this book. And I hope that that I've tonight given you a little bit to think about, and that the book gives you a little sense of what's going on in a bird's life, and will enhance your appreciation of them and of the natural world. So thank you. Thanks. And we have some time for questions. I'm happy to take questions, and there are microphones set up on either side in the middle of the auditorium.
David, in your evolution as a bird artist, I love the picture of the chimney swift taken from the air and showing the background, the ground. And that is a theme that's occurred in other artists' art. So it prompts me to question you about which artists have influenced you. And I know I saw a little bit of Robert Mengel in that chimney swift piece, but who have been your influences in developing your art?
Yeah, many. When I was just starting out, just really young, like 8 years old, I liked Don Eccleberry's paintings in The Birds of the West Indies, and that same book has black and white line drawings by Earl Poole, and the black and white drawings by George Sutton in a book called Fundamentals of Ornithology. And all those, one thing they all share is real simplicity, and kind of minimalist approach. And more recently, Lars Johnson, the Swedish artist who did a field guide to birds of Europe. I'm blanking on the. Well, there are Fuertes. These are older artists. Luis Agassiz Fuertes painted. He was way ahead of his time, painting very lifelike birds 100 years ago. Francis Lee Jaques, another artist from the early 1900s, mid 1900s. He did scratchboard drawings. He did oil paintings, but I really appreciated his scratchboard drawings. Scratchboard is a ink technique that's just black and white, almost like a woodcut, and he did just gorgeous. Again, very minimalist, very simplified, and that's, I think, the thing that I've always appreciated the most in art is the simplifying, the distilling of the image down to just a few lines, a sketch, a suggestion of the bird instead of a super detailed, very intricate painting. So, but yeah, I would single out actually Eccleberry and Sutton and Jaques as three of my real influences.
You were standing right.
This is a relatively specific question. I don't know if you have wisdom on it, but it occurred to me when you were talking about the V.
Mic drop.
We were talking about the V formations. I've always liked the way pelicans, when they're near the water, a line of them will kind of flow over the tops of the waves, keeping sort of the same distance the whole time.
Yeah.
And I was, is there something about the air above the water?
There is, and I don't know. Aerodynamics is very complicated, and I haven't I haven't done a lot of reading about that, but I do know that, I mean, there's an ocean wave moves through space, it's pushing air ahead of it. It's forcing air to move up ahead of it, and the birds can ride on that cushion of air. So pelicans do some of that. I think there's also a sort of compression effect as they get close to the ground, that their wings are pushing air down, like in the diagram of the geese. And as that air gets pushed down, if the water is just a few inches away, it can't go down. So there's a little cushioning effect of flying that close to the water. So I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that, but that's I think both of those things are happening, and that's what you're seeing with pelicans doing that. And then as they fly in a line, they're also taking advantage of that, the updrafts like the geese do.
There's only two. Hi,
Hi.
David. I awkwardly met you yesterday and professed my love for yellow-billed magpies. Um, I grew up in Templeton, and I just they're endemic to the area, and I feel a kinship with them. So I have actually two questions, if it's okay.
Yep.
One is a little heavier of a question. Since you've built your career on, learning about and loving birds, I'm sure it's been heartbreaking as there's been a lot of environmental effects and seeing some fall by the wayside. Um, I was curious if, in this large group of people that love birds, if you have organizations that you specifically recommend and investing in, other than maybe Audubon, for preserving a lot of these bird species.
Yeah, I think the the Nature Conservancy does fantastic work because fundamentally bird populations depend on habitat. That if we can give them space to do their thing, they will do it. So land preservation, local land trusts, the Nature Conservancy does a great job of preserving land, preserving habitat. And I think the American Bird Conservancy is doing the best national and international work in bird conservation right now, with a lot of different programs on educating people about house cats, about window strikes, and they've got projects going on with some really targeted land conservation for certain species. So I would single out those two national organizations, but also working locally with the local land trust, local parks department, um, those kinds of organizations, your local Audubon chapter, um, do really great work. I think universally really good work happens at the local level. So focusing locally is always a good thing.
Shout out to Pacific Wildlife Care.
All right.
And then my last question, and thank you so much, absolutely. I hadn't really thought of American Conservancy, wasn't as much on my radar, so thank you. And my last question is, all these fun things that you shared about the birds during this talk, I was curious if you had any fun ones about the yellow-billed magpie.
Oh, I think not about yellow-billed magpie particularly, magpies in general. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it was and this is probably research on European magpies, similar to black-billed, which is similar to yellow-billed, but magpies. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, they were the test subject in a study that found that birds recognized themselves in a mirror, which is a pretty high sort of what's the word? Self-aware. Yes. So yeah, I mean, magpies are incredibly intelligent, like many of the jays and crows, but that, if I'm remembering correctly, that was a study on magpies that found that they're one of the few animals besides humans that recognizes themselves in a mirror.
Which could be good, or maybe, they could stand
Yeah.
not to.
Yeah.
Too much.
Might be a sign of vanity.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. Appreciate
Yeah,
that.
welcome.
Good evening, David. How are you?
Hi, good.
Do you mind if I call you Dave? I'm just
Dave's
joking.
fine.
Thank you so much for coming. Obviously, on behalf of all of us, we're super grateful. I got a
Yes.
couple quick questions for you while you're here. First being top 5 birding spots in the US and your latest life bird.
Top 5 birding spots. Well, I put Cape May, Cape May, New Jersey at the top, is my favorite. And I lived there off and on for 20 years, and it was really instrumental in making the field guide possible, just because you can see so many birds so easily. I could actually say, oh, today I want to study song sparrows in flight, and walk across the field and flush 100 song sparrows and look at them in flight and do some sketches and say, good, that's done. And yeah, Cape May is just an amazing place. And Monterey Bay, Monterey Peninsula is also one of my favorites. I spent a lot of time there. And again, it's just constantly changing, constantly surprising. Birds moving by, and a lot of diversity right there in that immediate area. Southeast Arizona is another place I spent a lot of time, and I particularly liked the Chiricahuas and Cave Creek Canyon, as many people do. Camped there a lot in the 80s. And two more. Churchill, Manitoba. I led tours for Wings for about 10 years, and one of the tours that I did multiple times was to Churchill in June, right when the ice was breaking up in the river. And that was another place where there would just be waves of birds moving by. It's early spring there at the beginning of June, and there would one day, not much was happening in the morning, and then at about noon, flocks of Baird sandpipers started passing by, and thousands of Baird sandpipers flew by in the afternoon when there had been none in the morning. Things like that happened at Churchill. It's an incredibly rich, a very narrow strip of tundra on the edge of Hudson Bay, but incredibly rich. It's the most bird-rich tundra I've ever been to. And the river mouth also was constantly exciting. I was young then, so I would put the tour group to sleep and then drive the van by myself out to the river mouth at midnight and watch for a few hours in the 24-hour daylight and see Jaegers and Ross's gulls and Sabin's gulls and all the things that were flying around there. And then sleep for 2 hours and get up with the group and go birding again. And one more. Well, currently my backyard in Deerfield, Massachusetts. We live on an old farm, and it's just nice to walk out the back door and wander around the fields. And we've got about a dozen species of warblers that nest in the area, and lots of other things. So it's just I really enjoy. I've always been a local birder. I like to walk out the door and start birding. I don't like to get in the car and drive an hour to go birding somewhere. So Cape May appealed to me that way. I could just step out the door and immediately be birding, and everything was within 1 mile. So that's my 5. And my latest life bird, I think, it's, well, when I arrived here at the airport a few days ago, I stopped at Laguna Lake on my way over here, and I saw scaly-breasted munia. And it's been a long time since I birded in Southern California, so they have colonized the area since the last time I was birding here. So this is the first time I have seen scaly-breasted munia in North America. It's a new North American bird for me. So. Oh, over here.
Hi, David. I'm just wondering, in your latest book, what mediums did you use for your drawings and your paintings?
Yeah, these are all done with acrylic and pencil. And all of the I've used mostly gouache in the past, opaque watercolor. And that's what I used for all the field guide paintings. And it works really well for that. And I'd go back to gouache for those kinds of paintings now. I started using acrylic when I did the tree guide about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, because gouache didn't work. It doesn't do bright greens well. And there's a lot of bright greens in a tree guide. So I switched to acrylic, but I use it kind of like gouache, a lot of transparent washes and only a little bit of overpainting. But I really liked it for the freedom. I have a more, I feel more free with it. It's a looser style. And I wanted this book to have a kind of sketchbook feel, even in the finished paintings. So there's pencil lines and pencil outlines and some unfinished parts, and just like in this one, the foliage in the back is just some pencil outlines and then just dabbing on watery bits of light color. So I'm using acrylic, but in a very watercolor kind of way. Have another? Oh, okay. Yep. Yeah, well, the question is about structural color in birds. I describe it in the book, and it's color that's created by the structure of the feather rather than by pigment molecules. So the pigment is a molecule that interacts with the light waves electromagnetically. The electrons get excited and they release wavelengths of a certain color. That's the color we see. The structural color, like hummingbirds or all the blue color in birds, is structural color. It's the actual microscopic structure of the feather that enhances some wavelengths of light and reflects them and absorbs or cancels out all the others. And I was talking to someone about it yesterday. It's incredibly complex. And I had a very hard time simplifying it to the level that I needed to for the book, because it begins with the idea that light is a wave, and that light waves are bouncing around us in every direction all the time and scattering infinitely from every point that they hit something. And so it's mind-boggling what right there. You begin with something mind-boggling. Then hummingbirds' throat feathers, the basic idea is that there's layers, thin layers of material in the feathers. Light is reflecting off of the surface of each of those layers, and some penetrates through and reflects off the deeper layers. So light is bouncing off of 15 layers all at once. And the thickness of the layers is, it matches the wavelength of certain colors of light. So, and that's another basic fact, that light, what we perceive as color is light of different wavelengths. So red is long wavelengths, big long waves, and blue is very short waves. So the wavelength determines the color, and the wavelength interacts with the thickness of the layers. So the light of certain wavelengths reflecting off of all these different layers comes out in sync, so that 2 waves are, 15 waves are all working together, and you get one tidal wave of red color coming off the throat of an Anna's hummingbird, and all the other waves are bouncing around. They're they're a little bit too long or a little too short, they hit the different layers and they come out of sync and cancel out. And we don't see that color at all. We see black. And it is only the light that is reflecting off of the hummingbird's throat feathers in one direction, directly in front of the male hummingbird. Light that's bouncing off in other directions is all canceled out. All wavelengths cancel out, and it looks, when the hummingbird turns its head sideways, it looks black. When it turns to face you, you see that beam of a tidal wave of red light that is coming at you. So I hope that's clearer. But as my ornithologist friend would say, the reality is much more complicated.
It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you again, David. I was wondering, in all this talk of color, which you deal in so much in your art, was there any particular color of a bird that caused you to seek a new way to mix color together to get, or was there any particular color that was a challenge and then you found out that it was something very unexpected that you had to mix to get what you wanted?
Yeah, I guess I discovered early on in my painting that I did best with a very limited color palette. So for all of these paintings, my palette is basically 4 colors. I have a really dark blue, slightly greenish blue, a bright red, a bright yellow, and white. And then for some, like the scrub jay, I need a separate blue color. But most everything else I can mix from the dark green, red, and yellow and white. I can mix a gray by mixing the dark green and the red. And by adding little bits of yellow or varying the proportion of red and green, I can create any of the other colors. And I found that for me, it simplified the coloring of the paintings a lot. And if I ever tried to introduce another color out of a tube of paint, it just threw everything off. And I had so much more control by mixing my own black and gray and being able to make these adjustments. So if I needed a light buff color, it was just a little bit of gray made out of red and green, a little more yellow, and a lot of white, and mix all that together. And if it looks a little too red, you add more green. If it looks a little too green, you add more red. If it's too yellow, you add more red-green mix. And you can make all those adjustments. And one of the things I discovered very early on in the painting for the field guide was that most of what we call green or olive color in birds is a mix of gray and yellow. And I think that's how the birds do it. They're using melanin and carotenoid yellow pigments in their feathers. So they're mixing gray and yellow, and it looks sort of greenish. So if you take the color that I used in gouache for all of my black and gray is a color comes out of a tube called neutral tint. That was my black gray color. And if you mix neutral tint with yellow, you get a really nice olive, just like all of the warblers, kinglets, vireos, flycatchers, all the olive colored birds. So you don't bring green into it at all. Just stick with gray and yellow and you'll get those good olive tones.
Well, that's very enlightening. And I have one other question. I'm in the grandmother stage of my life, and many of my grandchildren are interested in birds, probably because my husband and I are interested in birds. But some of them do have an artistic bent, gift, whatever you want to call it. If they want to draw birds, where would you tell them to begin, or what would you have them do?
Well, drawing birds is just doing it, and making it fun. And seeing birds for me was a big inspiration for drawing them. For learning how to draw birds, there's quite a few resources out there. At the beginning of the pandemic, National Audubon, I did a series of bird drawing videos for National Audubon. There's a total of 10 little 5-minute videos of just simple instruction of how to draw a chickadee, an eagle, a tern, an owl. And I know my nieces and nephews had a lot of fun doing that and following along, and had some great results. And you have a great resource here in California with Jack Laws, who's done a lot of nature journaling and field sketching, and has a lot of resources, and a really excellent book on how to draw birds, so things like that.
I had the pleasure of having him in my classroom for a week. So that was wonderful. And that Audubon, the ones that you did, would I just Google
Yeah,
Audubon David Sibley drawings?
that will
Okay.
probably find it.
Okay,
Yes,
great.
I can't give you any better description than that.
Thank you.
Hello, David. Thanks a lot. That's great. Read the whole book. It's really fun for a lot of reasons. All the sidebar stuff is really interesting. But it made me think, there's only so many birds you could have put in that book, and you did. So you had to make choices. How'd you make those choices? And what birds were just left off on the cutting room floor? Is there a story about a bird that's not in the book?
Yeah. Yeah, it was tough. The book was very difficult to assemble. It's a lot of puzzle pieces to put together. Obviously, it's not linear. It's sort of linear in the taxonomy of birds, is roughly follows the checklist, but I wanted the birds featured in the portraits to be really familiar species, and going as far afield as roadrunner and puffin and things like that everyone has heard of, but many people wouldn't be able to see. But I think I had planned a few other species to be included, and the only one that I painted and didn't include was loggerhead shrike. I had a portrait of a shrike that didn't make it into the book. But there's so many, the research led in so many different directions, and there's so much more material that didn't make it into the book. And I was just talking with someone before this an hour ago about dipper. Dipper would have been a great species to include, and there's so much information, really cool information about dippers. One of the things I got talking about an hour ago was that dippers, when they blink, their eyelid is white. Their eyelid is covered with bright white feathers. So every time they blink, you see a white flash as their eyelid closes. And it's another example of nobody knows what it's for, what it signals. It must signal something, otherwise it wouldn't be bright white, but nobody knows why dippers have it. But doing research on that led me to research on the blinking rates of birds, and different groups, different species of birds blink at very different rates. Owls are the slowest, blinking only once every, I don't know, minute. Songbirds blink quickly. And then that research led me to some research on humans that found that blinking, as your eyelid closes, this thin layer of tissue covers your eye, and a little flash of red light gets into your optic nerve. And that flash of red light periodically is apparently really important in some way for our brain function, that we need these intermittent flashes of red light for some reason. And I didn't get any farther into that research, but that's the kind of thing that I would get off on these tangents when I was researching for the book, and discover really interesting things and interesting ideas. And I would say a lot of the stuff that's in the book is kind of buried in research papers, and a lot of the things that I'm presenting here as highlights was not really the focus of the research paper. It's kind of a sideline. They say we tested this, and it must mean that this is true. But of course, scientific research is inherently very cautious, and also always looking forward to the next project. So the scientific papers are written in a sort of style of, the evidence that we have suggests this, we're going to test more, or we're going to try to understand how this happens, why this works, what this does, et cetera, et cetera. And I say, but wait, what you found there is actually really amazing, and you're not really putting that out there. Anyway, there was a tremendous amount of material that I found and thought was really interesting, and couldn't fit into the book, or didn't quite find a place for, or didn't have the species to cover it. And in the end, there was a deadline approaching, and I had to say, okay, I'm not going to do any more with Loggerhead Shrike.
No, it was great. The small details, I think, are what make that book really good. Just the little things you'd never think of. So I appreciated that. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
So having illustrated this untold number of species over so many years, would you say that you have an artistic nemesis bird? By which I mean the one that has just been harder to get right than any of the others.
Yeah, I have the hardest time with the herons and egrets. I would say that they're and they look so graceful, especially at a distance. And up close, they look very prehistoric, reptilian, kind of dangerous. And finding the balance between those visuals, and also they're large birds. So when you shrink that, a 4-foot tall great blue heron, when you shrink it down to a 6-inch tall image on a piece of paper, the tolerance for those curves and angles is very, very small. So a line being off by a fraction of a millimeter is really significant at that level. And I think that's one of the things that makes drawing herons and egrets so difficult. But most birds, with enough practice, enough trial and error, I was able to figure out some sort of trick to like leave something out, or leave one line vague and let your brain fill it in. And I never really figured that out with herons and egrets.
So my question is, since you've had to kind of transition, or when you started publishing in guides and books and things, did you find that you had to change your artwork in any way to satisfy the publisher? And how difficult was that for you to make the transition from just being able to have fun with your art and knowing that it was going into a book that was being published, especially for a field guide?
Yeah, I think when I was working on the field guide in the 1990s, I had such a clear vision of what I was doing that it didn't really, nothing else really mattered. I was just forging ahead with what I had in mind. And my goal then was to paint birds the way I see them through binoculars, to try to illustrate what they looked like to me through binoculars at a distance. So that level of detail and focusing on the shapes and proportions and that kind of appearance. And the requirements for a book like this are very different or much looser. A field guide's very constrained. The illustrations have to be accurate enough so that anyone, and sort of universal enough so anyone can look at them and recognize the bird. A book like this is more free form and can be more artistic, more so there were different challenges with this, of just sitting down and figuring out what story to tell with each illustration. I would say that the biggest transition I'm experiencing right now, I've actually the last couple of years started doing a lot of digital illustration on iPad and with Photoshop, and it's great. It has rejuvenated my interest in illustrating, and I'm doing a lot of more detailed field guide type illustrations with that, and getting into a lot of other projects that I really couldn't do with paint on paper. I put one on my website about a year ago about common grackles, subspecies of common grackles. The iridescence is very difficult to capture in paint. And then showing all the subtle variations in iridescence across all of the range of common grackles would have been a months-long project and a hugely frustrating project with paint, with a lot of pieces of paper just thrown in the trash. But digitally, it's much easier. I can tweak the colors until they're just right, just by putting on a layer and adjusting the hue or saturation of one part of the illustration. So that's been a revelation, to being able to do things like that. But it does, and I think it also feeds into the way bird identification has changed in the last 30 years, which is what we deal with now is a lot more identifying birds in photographs, looking at a photograph instead of the view through binoculars. So the illustrations that are useful for identifying birds need to show a lot of different things than what I was trying to show in the 1990s, because the demands of identification of the birder trying to identify birds, the demands are quite different now, because so many birds are being identified from photographs, and you can see really different things. You don't get a sense of the shape or posture or movement of the bird as much. You can see details of feather patterns and feather lengths and really small details that you really can never see in a living bird. So that transition is the one that, it's the way birding has changed that has made me realize that my field guide illustrations from the 1990s with a binocular perspective look very old-fashioned now. And I think the field guides going forward will have to cater to this, the photography-based identification a lot more. But I would say, I like to stress that illustration, I think, is a really critical, a really important part of science and the interpretation of science. That photographs, a field guide using photographs can never do what an illustrated field guide does. So I think that even when we're trying to identify birds from photographs, using illustrations will work better than using photographs as the guide. So I hope that there are more illustrators, and I believe that there are still more illustrators coming along who will carry the torch of creating illustrations of birds. And it's a great way to learn about birds also. I've made a lot of discoveries through the process of illustration. So that's my little preaching about illustration. And thank you.
Nice round of applause. Thank you. Thanks for David for being here. We're going to close now, and if you brought a book to be signed, just hang loose, stay where you are, and we'll give you instructions on how we're going to do that. Thank you, everybody. Good night.